Access to Democracy is made possible by donations from the following organizations. Thomson Reuters, a global company with expertise and insight to unravel complex situations in the areas of law, tax, compliance, government, and media. Their worldwide network of journalists and editors keep customers up to speed on relevant global events. Crutchfield Dermatology, a full-service treatment center and Medi-Spa in Eagan. Their goal is to help you look good and feel great with beautiful skin. With service built around courtesy, dignity, and respect, Mayo-trained Dr. Charles Crutchfield personally treats each patient and is acknowledged as one of the nation's best physicians. Truestone Financial, with locations in Minnesota and Wisconsin, has proudly served its members since 1939. Truestone engages, educates, and supports its members to ensure they have the tools to empower their financial well-being. Truestone Financial, your neighborhood credit union. Learn more at truestone.org. Edina Eye Physicians and Surgeons, a division of Twin Cities Eye Consultants, has proudly served the Twin Cities for more than 55 years now in 7 convenient locations. Using the most advanced technology combined with human touch, Edina Eye offers comprehensive services and dedicated specialists committed to excellence, with innovative procedures and expertise for the most advanced eye care.
Welcome to another episode of Access to Democracy. I'm your guest host today, Steve Francisco. It's a real pleasure to welcome an old friend and colleague, Ethan Roberts, from the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas. Ethan, I believe it's your first appearance on our show. Welcome to Access to Democracy.
Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here.
Thanks for coming down. Tell us a little bit about JCRC, what it is, what its mission is, and what your work involves at the Jewish Community Relations Council.
Sure. So the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas is essentially the public affairs voice for the Jewish community of Minnesota, North Dakota, and South Dakota. We actually encompass the largest geographic area of any JCRC in the country. Minnesota and Dakotas all being relatively large states. But most of my work is focused here, of course, on Minnesota. And there are many different organizations in the Jewish community. Some are here, social service agencies. Obviously, people would think about synagogues, community centers. But our work is really public affairs and community relations. So, for example, if someone from the media is curious, what is the Jewish perspective on the situation in Israel, Palestine, or what do you think about this, the rise, or what do you think accounts for the rise in anti-Semitism? We would be a natural destination. But at the same time, we are constantly working on strengthening, expanding relationships outside of our Jewish community. So I know we'll talk
with other faith communities,
with other ethnic groups, but also with law enforcement. So, for example, the JCRC is the kind of outward face, or we're the connector between our Jewish community and federal, state, local law enforcement. But yes, of course, of other faith communities and various coalitions, both formal and informal.
Mm-hmm. I want to read you a statement from the writer Carrie McWilliams. Minneapolis at one time had a very unfortunate reputation. In fact, Mr. McWilliams once said that Minneapolis, he described it in 1946 as the anti-Semitic capital of the United States. That's a pretty damning indictment of Minneapolis in the 1940s. What is the state of the Jewish community in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities here in the year 2022? How would you describe it?
Significantly better.
Thank goodness.
Thank goodness. I mean, the JCRC was founded, like other JCRCs or other Jewish community organizations, in the 30s, in the 40s, in response to, honestly, a level of anti-Semitism that neither of I in our lifetimes have ever experienced. You can go to the Holocaust Museum, the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., and they have a lot of the artifacts and things you would have about the Holocaust in Europe, right, in Africa. But then there's a permanent, almost like a permanent special exhibit about the United States and the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And the thing that always sticks with me are these two polls they did. One poll was, what do you think of, and this is in the late 30s, before the United States enters World War II, and one is like, what do you think about German treatment of Jews? And this is after Kristallnacht. I mean, people had a sense. We don't have Auschwitz yet, but people have a sense that Hitler is incredibly anti-Semitic. And the response overwhelmingly is people were like, yeah, that's bad. And then the next poll they have right next to it at the same time was, do you support allowing Jewish children to come to the United States? Overwhelmingly no.
Wow.
And so, yes, Minneapolis for sure, had some significant challenges that may have made it worse than St. Paul. But we're talking about an overall climate of anti-Semitism nationally.
I was reading, this is very interesting to me, that some of the discrimination that Jewish people had to endure here in our community in the 1930s, basically prohibitions on joining various social clubs, even down to not being allowed to join AAA, the Automobile Association, which today you might even laugh at that, or it seems incredible to even suggest that. There were also restrictive covenants where people could not sell homes to Jewish people, very similar to the same types of discriminatory restrictive covenants against African Americans. And so wasn't this a factor in why it was important for the JCRC to be created?
Absolutely. And actually, I want to give credit to Dr. Kristen Delegard and her Mapping Prejudice project. She's done amazing work on this. She'd be actually a fabulous guest if she hasn't been already on the show.
Very good idea.
Yeah.
I saw her program on TPT.
Right, and you'll see that, rightfully so, most of the focus is on the African American community, because really for them, it was much, much worse. Even if the covenants may have been in place with Jews, how much were they enforced? A lot of this is like the kind of the gentleman's agreement, right? That famous film, that kind of like social anti-Semitism. This is different actually than the violent anti-Semitism of like the silver shirts, which were fascist gangs. I mean, at one point, it was actually physically dangerous to be Jewish in the Twin Cities. This kind of like, you can't be a member, you can't join this hospital or this law firm or this club. This is common, and this is why in the United States we have a lot of hospitals which were originally Jewish hospitals, because that's the only place where Jews could work, and then eventually they get kind of folded in.
When I was a baby, I was actually a patient in the old Mount Sinai Hospital,
which is
in
now
Minneapolis,
Abbott, North,
part of Abbott.
which is where my daughter was born.
Let's transition here to, and it's really on the same theme, but a very disturbing series of anti-Semitic attacks and incidents that we've seen happen, not just in our own community, but actually are happening all over the nation and frankly all over the world. This sudden surge of anti-Semitism that we see happening. October 2018, the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, the deadliest attack against the Jewish community in U.S. history. 11 people killed, 6 wounded, including several Holocaust survivors. The attacker used a Colt AR-15 assault rifle and was also armed with 3 Glock semi-automatic pistols. In April of 2019, we saw an attack at the Poway Synagogue in Poway, California, near San Diego. On the last day of Passover, a 60-year-old woman was killed shielding the rabbi, who was also wounded in the attack. Again, the attacker was armed with a semi-automatic rifle. Closer to home, the Anti-Defamation League has reported 144 anti-Semitic incidents in Minnesota, 188 incidents in North Dakota and South Dakota in 2020-21, 84% increase in reported incidents. Why are we seeing this surge of anti-Semitism? What are the factors that are causing these things to happen, do you think?
So anti-Semitism exists across the political spectrum. When you're speaking of the incidents in Tree of Life or in Poway, this is very much part and parcel of white nationalism, white supremacy. That synagogue in Poway, in Pittsburgh, Tree of Life, was targeted explicitly because the work that synagogue was doing in support of immigrants. It's this theory of white genocide, and that the killer. I mean, he literally wrote this, so this is not like conjecture on our part. He said I think something like, "Damn your optics! I'm not going to let my people be slaughtered. I'm going in." And what were these elderly Holocaust survivors doing to warrant such violence? Well, their synagogue was supporting HIAS, and HIAS is a venerable Jewish organization that began with Jews who were seeking refuge in our country, and has continued to help other people who aren't Jewish seeking refuge in our country. And because informed by their Jewish values, their Jewish principles, or our beliefs to welcome the stranger, right? That the synagogue was involved in that work, and this person who wants America to be a whites-only country, and looks at like the diversity and thinks this is a real threat, had to take out target that
Didn't
synagogue.
we see a blatant manifestation of exactly what you're talking about in Charlottesville?
Yes.
When you saw neo-Nazis marching through Charlottesville, Virginia, yelling, "Jews will not replace us."
And what people need to also remember about that is that the whole situation in Charlottesville begins with the removal of a statue of Robert E. Lee, right?
That's right.
And that was like many statues put up, in the Jim Crow era, as a way of like reminding African Americans, like, know your place, right? And it's a symbol of white supremacy. And so why were they chanting, right, Jews will not replace us? And why was there so much anti-Semitism when the story about civil rights to civil war? And it's again because in the view of these white supremacists, Jews are kind of at the vanguard of everything that they don't want. And so it's this conspiracy theory, which is how anti-Semitism often operates, of Jewish manipulation of the media, of our politics, of our culture. And they were very narrowly targeting, right, that Jewish community, because they were like, but for the Jews, that statue might still be there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very disturbing stuff. And it really fits in with a pattern that we've seen in the news and has been brought to the attention of our policymakers, legislators. The director of the FBI, Christopher Wray, recently stated that this kind of radical extremism is a threat, is the #1 security threat to the country. And I think so many Americans are used to thinking of national security threats as coming outside of the country.
Sure.
We just saw yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol by insurrectionists. So this seems to be part and parcel of that same kind of extremism that is a threat to our national security.
I mean, I'm not going to say that we're not also concerned about threats that emanate from abroad.
Right.
That is still something, but absolutely, I think the FBI is on target in terms of their estimation about where these dangers come from. And what really makes it so frightening, a couple factors. One, obviously very easy access to firearms, right?
Mm-hmm.
And two, the ability...
That's why I mentioned the issue about the type of weapons that were used.
But how people can be so radicalized, through the internet. So like, I'm sure back in the day, the FBI was constantly trying to break, into some cell, a network of the KKK or something like that. Well, what are you going to do about the person who's never on your radar, in their, the image of
wolf.
right? They're in their underwear in their basement, right, on 8chan, and they found a community, right? And so even though their ideas, these violent ideas, are really outside the mainstream, they don't feel that way because they have a community of like-minded people on the internet.
I want to ask you about that specifically because I did want to ask about the role of social media and the internet in the spread of hatred. What can we do, mindful that we live in a country with a First Amendment that it protects freedom of expression, including reprehensible expression?
Sure.
But there is a line when we cross from constitutionally protected free speech to speech that incites violence or encourage or outright calls for violence. How can we tame social media, or can we?
Well, first of all, I mean, because we're both attorneys, and here we are sitting in the lovely Thomson Reuters building, right? The government, that's the First Amendment concerns. The action by the government, Facebook, Twitter, any social media company, they're a private business. They are not restricted by, the First Amendment, right, doesn't apply in the same way as like, University of Minnesota campus.
Right.
And so Facebook is absolutely within their legal right, as is Twitter, to ban people and organizations or groups that engage in inflammatory, hateful, violent speech, which, might not run afoul of the First Amendment, but nonetheless, it's their platform, right? And they have that right. And that's not censorship, right? That's a business making a smart business decision that we don't need to have, folks who are, trying to whip up a race war, right, on their platform. You know what? There's enough customers out there who are trying to whip up a race war, right? We could, do without them. And you're seeing that they're doing more, but clearly there's still so much more that needs to be done.
That has to be done, right. Let's shift focus a little bit to the JCRC's work on federal, state, and local aid to Jewish organizations that do really valuable work in our community. Tell us about some of that work. I saw online that you protect or help protect $27 million in annual aid to social service providers and schools. We're talking here, aren't we, about older adult services, people with disabilities. Tell us a little bit more about your work.
Well,
in
I mean,
that
I think this
area.
actually kind of brings us full circle, because when I first met you, Steve, you were at the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits, and you were doing federal policy work. And clearly, there is a substantial amount of money which flows to nonprofits and some for-profits, of course, as well, through the Medicare and Medicaid program. And so, here in Minnesota, we have Shalom, which is doing. I just want to give a shout out to Barb Click. She's their CEO and their entire team. I mean, we think our life is hard, whatever, during a pandemic. I mean, can you imagine working in a nursing home, right? The challenges that they've had, and they've just been amazing. And, the ability for them to kind of keep that work going is obviously through these federal programs. So yes, of course, we're part of those conversations. There's also money which flows not just to the Jewish community, but also to other houses of worship through the federal government, the Federal Nonprofit Security Grant Program. And then one of the things that we did in Minnesota at the state capitol is we have a supplemental program that's the State Nonprofit Security Grant Program. And that's for those who apply for the federal program, are unsuccessful, but are still high quality.
So they have another
There's
opportunity.
a supplemental pool of money. Yeah.
Very good.
Yep.
Let's talk about social studies standards. I know that JCRC, and this is a subject dear to your heart,
is.
You and I have discussed this. In August 2021, 157 leaders from Minnesota, including your boss, Steve Hunnigs, who's been a guest on our program numerous times. Alan Miller has interviewed him, representing a wide range of faith communities. They signed a joint letter to the Minnesota Department of Education calling for a full list of world religions to be included in the next and final draft of the K through 12 social studies standards. Tell us a little bit more about that. What's at stake here, and why is it important that this be done?
Okay, so every 10 years, Minnesota undergoes a reassessment and rewriting of our various educational standards. So not just social studies, also like math, English, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
We are at the part right now where they're focusing on social studies, and it's a multi-year process. In the existing standards and benchmarks, there are explicit references to Judaism and other designated world religions for both middle school and high school. This means that, let's say a teacher, let's say in greater Minnesota, wants to teach about Judaism and Islam, and they get pushback from members of the community, right? People are coming to school board meetings and they're hollering, you shouldn't be teaching about Judaism or Islam, whatever. They have this safe harbor, this legal cover, because this document requires it. So when it's part of our standards and benchmarks, school districts can say, this is actually what's expected. And why is that important? Because how can you be an educated person? How can you graduate from high school without having an appreciation? And we argued not just about Judaism historically, like the Second Temple period, the time of Jesus, right? But Judaism today, or Islam, or Christianity.
Right. And let's be very clear. The type of instruction we're talking about doesn't run afoul of the Constitution on separation of church and state. It's not proselytizing.
No.
But we're talking about the historical contributions.
Teaching about religion.
Religion.
Not trying to make anybody religious or a particular faith, of course. Just teaching about how, like other things like race and gender and geography inform someone's identity, religion does as well.
Yeah.
And this work has been really great in terms of the relationship part of the JCRC, because we've had such an amazing half year at least now with the Sikh community, which sometimes is pronounced Sikh, but they pronounce it Sikh.
S-I-K-H.
Right. Fifth largest religion in the world. Not mentioned in Minnesota's current standards and benchmarks. Not at all.
Even though right here in Dakota County, we have, I believe, a temple down the road here in our county.
Yeah, you have actually you have in Bloomington, I believe, actually, is where.
Oh.
Yeah. So. But in any event, the Sikh community has been advocating for years to be in the benchmarks, and so when that first draft came out and they weren't in there, they were really disappointed. And then when that second draft came out in the summer, not only was the Sikh community, Sikhism not mentioned, neither was Judaism, neither was Islam or Christianity.
Wow.
And so we really needed to really pull out all the stops. So the petition was one part of it, but hundreds of people wrote impassioned emails to the Department of Education, educators, parents, grandparents.
And this crosses the political spectrum.
Democrats, Republicans, evangelical Christians, liberal Protestants.
Believers, non-believers.
Of course, because, again, how can you be an educated person? Not only is it about your education, but it's also really important for members of minority faiths such as ours to be seen, right? And also not to have to be the source of education. It is a lot to ask a child. Imagine, for example, a boy who's sick and really is outwardly, appears like a sick individual, having to explain to his colleagues about his faith. That's not, and his colleagues, his fellow students.
Right.
That's not fair.
Right.
Right? And so really that's the kind of education that should come from adults. Either it could come, through the teacher, or one thing that JCRC does, and we sometimes often partner with our friends at Islamic Resource Group, is we have trained professionals who, for no cost at all to the schools, come into schools and we teach about Judaism. Which is, great for a teacher who might not feel super confident about it. And, we kind of do a really comprehensive package, and sometimes, as I said, we partner with our friends in the Muslim community, and it's awesome.
And do you produce materials, teaching materials that schools can use?
We have a PowerPoint presentation, of course, that goes with that lesson plan.
Very
sure.
good.
Yeah.
Let's talk about remembering the Holocaust. I know that part of JCRC's important mission, one of those aspects of your mission, is remembering the Holocaust and promoting Holocaust education. Time is taking its toll. We're living through a time when more and more Holocaust survivors are passing away, frankly, due to time and age. And we are going to approach a point soon where there will be no living witnesses who lived through the Holocaust. Right. What is JCRC doing to perpetuate and advance education about the Holocaust for this generation and future generations when there will be no Holocaust survivors?
So that is one of the core missions of the JCRC, is Holocaust remembrance and education. So, for example, we organize the community Yom HaShoah service every year, which is the holiday that commemorates the Holocaust. We also organize a trip for high school students, college students, law enforcement, and members of the National Guard and others to Washington, D.C. It's a one-day trip where we go to the Holocaust Museum. Of course, it's a full day, so students will often go to other museums like the Native American Museum or the African American Museum or just the monuments.
Can I just tell people too, I will never forget the first time. I was living in Washington when the Holocaust Museum opened, and I remember visiting shortly thereafter. I got through all of the exhibits, but I think it was the last exhibit that I saw that just completely demolished me, and it was a room full of shoes, and the shoes represented men and women and children who were murdered in the Holocaust, and it just had such a profound impact.
It's as personal.
Anybody who has a chance to get to Washington definitely needs to visit the Holocaust Museum.
Those are two kind of key things, right? But beyond that is it's education. We have a speakers bureau, and yes, for many, many, many years it was Holocaust survivors, and now, as you said, I mean, I've been to more funerals of Holocaust survivors I've known, right? And it's more really their kids or their grandkids, and so that's something that we do is we maintain the speakers bureau of 3G, so third generation or second generation. Do often wonderful jobs of mixing both their family story and then kind of like the bigger picture. And so, that's absolutely a huge part of our work. It's something also that's important about the standards, because when the first draft came out of the standards and benchmarks, they had removed the references to the Holocaust. It was an oversight. It was truly an oversight. I really want to be clear about this. The document was much shorter than it.
That's a stunning oversight.
There was a lot of oversights, but it provided an opportunity. And so working with our friends and colleagues at the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Minnesota, the JCRC formulated 5 benchmarks. There's 2 right now, 5 benchmarks dealing with Holocaust and genocide to the Department of Education, which all were incorporated in the second draft. So actually, when this comes online, the way that Holocaust and genocide are taught in our public schools will be better because of this oversight.
Yeah. I want to ask you too, another aspect of JCR's mission, obviously advocacy for Israel.
Yeah.
Say a word about that, because I suspect this is an area where I think people who are not familiar with the Jewish community or don't know Jewish people and talk to them about what's happening in Israel sometimes form opinions that are erroneous or not really based on facts. For example, assuming that, it means all Jewish people monolithically support a particular policy of a government, whether it was former Prime Minister Netanyahu or others, settlements issues, things such as this. Say something about that.
Well, I think
about your advocacy work for Israel.
I think, like everything, I always want to step back and kind of funnel in, right? And so to understand, I am Jewish, obviously. I work for the JCRC in this role, but Judaism is the religion of the Jewish people. Think about that. the Jewish people. We are first and foremost a people who have a particular faith. This is why, for example, it makes sense for someone to be Jewish and an agnostic. Jewish and an atheist. That wouldn't make sense in a lot of other contexts of other religions. And so, as one people, I have literally no choice but to be concerned about the welfare of Jews everywhere, because this is like one family. And so when over half of the world's Jewish population lives in Israel, like their very lives, that is my problem. That is my concern. They are my family, whether they're blood related to me or not. And so we have to kind of start, and that is true that overwhelming majority of Jews, American Jews, have some attachment to Israel. This is a completely different question about whether I support every decision that the government of Israel makes or not, right?
I suspect you don't, just like
I feel the same way about our government.
Right.
Right. But when it comes to the advocacy of the JCRC, let's get real here. I never served in the military. I live in Plymouth, Minnesota, right? Whether my opinions about what on earth Israel should do with respect to rocket fire coming in from Gaza, if I'm wrong, I'm still living in Plymouth, Minnesota. So there is a certain amount of deference to decisions that the Israeli government needs to make to secure the lives of its people. And so, for example, when we have a situation in May where Hamas is targeting Israeli civilians while hiding behind their own civilians, we are going to defend Israel's right to defend itself.
Thank you, Ethan.
Sure.
Before we let you go today, I have to bring up a subject that I know is dear to your heart.
Okay.
One of your hobbies that those of us who know you admire about you, among other things, is you are a photographer.
I am, yeah.
And I don't know if I can call you an amateur photographer anymore, because you actually have your own business and do photographs. You have a website. Tell us about, how did you become interested in photography?
Well, I mean, I think part of it was like a hobby for my
30 seconds.
Okay, for my father. But look, JCRC is a small nonprofit, right? We all have to do multiple things. And so I had been taking photos at our events for a long time. And people ask me, hey, can you do it for my son's bar mitzvah? And I'm like, sure. I love it. It's a creative outlet. And honestly, as much as I enjoy my job, politics today can be really depressing. Photography, it's a lovely outlet.
That's a great thing to have. Ethan, I want to thank you for coming on Access to Democracy. We'd love to have you back again in the future. Ethan Roberts, Government Affairs Director for the Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas.
Thank you, Steve.